Welcome back to Ride JBI. This is JB. Today we finished a suspension revalve and rebuild on this 2020 Sherco 300 factory two-stroke. The stock suspension on this bike is KYB 48mm SSS on the forks and a KYB 18mm shock shaft with 50mm piston on the shock. What's interesting about this is, to my knowledge, this is the first KYB shock with a 50mm piston. That's the main damping piston in this area, to come with a 18mm shock shaft. Previously, actually still, all of the YZ two-stroke motocross models utilize an 18mm shock shaft, but it is paired to a 46mm piston. The four-strokes in 06 to 09 featured that as well, the YZF models. But then in 2010, they went back to the 16mm shock shaft, but then they also updated the shock to a 50mm piston. So again, unique to these Shercos is that it is a KYB shock with a 50mm piston, but the 18mm shock shaft. Now, the stock settings for these off-road model bikes are very well received and work very well for the majority of riders. For some of the riders that do more of the technical single track riding, and what I mean by technical is the speeds at which you ride at. So primarily second gear, low momentum as you ride, meaning you don't have a lot of rolling speed as you go into obstacles, such as rocks, roots, ledges. So because of that, you need suspension that is very soft to compress instead of having the bike deflect. In that case, some riders find the suspension, mostly the forks, to be a little too stiff. And a lot of that is because of the mid-valve configuration in these KYB SSS 48mm twin chamber forks. These utilize the KYB's leaf spring mid-valve, which is common in all the Yamaha YZ models, and works very well for motocross, supercross, and some off-road applications. But for the more technical off-road applications, it is often too stiff of a mid-valve design / feature. Over here at Ride JBI, we modify this. We still utilize the leaf spring design, just different settings. Settings that are a little bit softer, but not to a point that the shims will fatigue and break. That is very important. It's easy to make things stiffer or softer, but you also got to keep in mind is long-term functionality of the shim design that you're using. I guess more appropriately said, the shim stack design that you are using. Because suspension is really about managing pressures. Yes, oil does flow through valves, but the real thing that we're doing is managing the pressure that builds up inside the forks and shock. And the more efficiently we do that, the more effectively the suspension works. The more efficient a fork and shock performs, the wider variety of terrain and riding types the suspension can handle well on. It's when a shock absorber or fork is poorly set up and inefficient at its job. What I mean by that is creating compression and rebound damping. Then the suspension tends to have a very narrow window at which it performs well in. And when you go outside of that window, it performs quite poorly. Again, these Sherco motorcycles come really well set up for off-road riding, right from the factory for the majority of riders. But for some of you that are doing more of the technical riding, I think you'll be very pleased with our JBI suspension flowy single track and or technical single track spec that we have developed. If you'd like Ride JBI to do your suspension, please give us a call or send us an email. We'll talk about the year, make, model bike that you have, the options that are available, and what would work best for you. All JBI suspension services and parts can be found at ridejbi.com.